I want to get into the camera's focusing systems. We're going to start off with the basic focusing ideas, and then we're going to move into some of the more advanced focusing features. I want you to think of this in terms of how the camera focuses, when the camera is focusing, and where the camera is focusing. How, when, and where. If you think of it this way, it'll be easy. So, how does the camera focus? Most cameras by default focus with a halfway shutter button depression. I'm not pushing it down all the way. It's almost like a soft, spongy resistance, and you get to this kind of a hard point, and then we push it down all the way to take the picture. You will also notice we get a green indication in our focusing box, and we also get this green light right here on the handle. It's telling us the camera's focused. We also have this autofocus on button on the back of the camera, and by default, that too will engage the camera's focusing systems where we would push, hold, and then push the shutter button down to take the picture. It's a second way. A third way we can do this is by using the touch focusing feature where we could touch and it's telling us in green we have achieved focus lock. We can focus in different places. So that is a third way that we can demonstrate how we can focus the camera. 3 different ways. The next part of this is the when the camera is focusing, whether this is a one-time focus or a repeated focus. So the way we access these are on the front of the camera by pushing the autofocus mode button. Get out of this. I'm going to turn that off. And I'm going to turn that off all the way. And I push that button, it's going to pull up the focus mode menu. Single AF means the camera is going to focus one time, and as long as you are engaging the focusing mechanism, it will stay locked. This means that we can, for example, get a focusing lock on a subject. If we hold it down, we can move the camera to make the composition more aesthetically pleasing. So we have focus lock, hold down, recompose, take the picture. Every good photographer knows how to do this with autofocus single. Autofocus single is really designed for subjects that are cooperating, like adults. It's also good for things that do not move, maybe architecture, product photography. Small kids, not so much, because small kids like to move around. Sport shooting, not so much. Birds in flight, not so much, because they're moving. So, autofocus single is a one-time focus lock. The one above it, continuous autofocus, is different. This is going to focus the camera over and over and over again in real time. So as long as we're engaging the focusing systems, the camera is going to be refocusing. It doesn't really work with recomposing because the camera is going to be refocusing on whatever we're pointing our focusing square at. Continuous autofocus is perfect for sports shooting. If you're doing any kind of sports shooting, small children who do not cooperate, birds in flight, you are going to want to be on continuous autofocus. And I'm just reaching up and pushing this autofocus button in the front of the camera on the left side as we hold it. There is a third focusing time, which is manual focus, which means the camera is not going to focus at all. It means that we have to manipulate the focusing ring on the front of our camera in order to achieve focus. And you'll notice that as I'm turning this, our target is getting blurry. It's getting out of focus. Sometimes that can be hard to see. So there are some great focusing tools that I'll demonstrate, including taking the joystick, pushing it in to the camera body so we can get this artificial zoom on that focusing target. You can see it better. And now, as I watch the monitor and I rotate this, I know that that is tack sharp. It's a way to zoom in. Really a great little tool. That is called manual zoom focusing. It's really good for things like videography, or maybe macro photography or product photography where things are not moving and you do not want the autofocus to change. So that is the when the camera is focusing, whether it's a one-time focus or a continuous repeated over and over and over again focus. Or we also have manual focus, the 3 different types of focusing modes. Let's talk about the where the camera is focusing. This is a little confusing in terms of how to access it. So I'm going to show you in the deep menu first. We have our autofocus area. Maybe we should turn this. Oh, I need to turn manual focus back on. I need to turn it back to single focus, for example. Come into the menu. And you're going to notice we have our focusing modes here in the menu if we need to access them a different way. So in our deep menu on the AF/MF tab, we have this feature here called AF mode. I don't really like to use that because it's confusing with focusing mode. I like to refer to these as clusters, different shapes and sizes of focusing points. There's 4 of them that we see here: single point, zone, wide in tracking, and this is going to change to whether we're in a single focusing mode or a continuous focusing mode. And then we have all. So this is what they look like in the menu, but when we're shooting, we don't really see these. So I'm going to tap the shutter button. And what I'm going to do is move the focusing square. This is how we can access it. Just move the joystick around, and we can access each of those focusing clusters when it's highlighted in green by rotating the rear control wheel. So here we have a single focusing point. It's really small and really precise. Here we have a slightly larger zone, and we can control more and more area that the camera is looking in for the single point. When we get to a zone, now we're starting to give the camera permission to look within this area for an area of contrast. And when we get to wide, we're giving the camera permission to find anything that it thinks is close to the camera with high contrast. Now, there's something very important about this, is that if you want to jump back to that cluster selection, all you have to do is push your joystick in a direction and you'll see this green frame. When you see that green frame, you rotate your rear control wheel and you can go back to a different size that you want. We are going to select the focusing square depending on the type of subject matter that we're shooting. For example, portraits, we want to focus on the eye. And there's a better way to do eye focus than using a focusing square that I will demonstrate in just a moment. But for sports shooting, especially, is you're going to want to select a focusing square depending on the subject matter. Like if you have a bird in flight, probably going to be shooting in wide. Why? Because they're very fast. They can be anywhere in the frame. We want the camera to help us focus. If we're shooting something like macro photography, well, then we're probably going to choose a very specific focusing point and tell the camera to look at that spot. A very common question I get is, how do we tell the camera to focus in 2 different places at the same time? It cannot be done. That's not how it works. For single images, the camera can only focus on 1 point at a time. There are ways to kind of get around this, but I will demonstrate focus stacking and bracketing and all that stuff on the crash course for product photography and things like that. So the focusing clusters allow us to tell the camera, I want you to focus right here and nowhere else. If we decide to change the size of that, then we're starting to give the camera permission to find an area of contrast in that position and to focus on that. And that is the idea of where the camera is focusing. We tell it different sizes and different positions on where to look for focus, and the camera will do the rest. Now, there's something important I need to show you, is that let's go to a wide mode here. You'll notice that in autofocus single, like if I put my hand here and I get a focus, it's just focusing on my hand, right? So watch this. If you go into autofocus continuous, and let's go to a zone, let's go into the wide area, which is really a tracking mode. Watch what happens. So I put my hand in front, halfway shutter button depression. Watch how that green square is moving where my hand goes. That is a tracking mode that only works in autofocus continuous. You will not see that on autofocus single. It's pretty good if you have a single subject on high contrast. Tracking is not going to work as well if you're shooting a soccer game, because there's lots of motion front, behind your subject, lots of moving people. It just depends on what you're shooting. And this is why I go through these on the crash course, is I demonstrate different situations for different focusing methods. But that is the tracking mode in autofocus continuous. One of the cool features that you should be aware of is face and eye detection. By default, it's going to be set up by the bottom button just behind white balance. It's turned off now, and I put a picture of myself up here to demonstrate eye detection. So when you're shooting portraits, this is a fantastic way to do it because we want one of the eyes to be in focus. So I press face and eye detection, face on, eye auto. And you'll notice this little white square popping up on either of my eyes. And when I push the shutter button halfway down, we get a green focusing box that's telling us it's in focus. Take the picture. Very straightforward, very fast, easy way to have a high percentage of keepers when you're doing portraits, especially when you're shooting one person. When you start shooting multiple people, it may become a problem because the camera won't know exactly which eye to jump onto. And then we can turn it off again by pushing this button here. We have some control over this in the menu system. Something I need to point out is that our focusing square, when we have eye detection, you can see it's turned on right where our metering mode would be. But in this case, I have a focusing box that I am moving away from the face. And when I'm focusing, eye detection is not working. This will cause some confusion if you do not know what's going on. And essentially, our focusing square that we're using should be over our subject matter. Now it's working again. So that's what's happening. Really, when you're doing this, we really want our focusing cluster to be full frame. So this can be a problem if we're doing it in a tracking mode when we're trying to use the all area, right? So what you want to do is put this back into single autofocus. Now, no matter where we turn the camera, eye detection is locking in. If we want to have some control, let's say you're shooting 2 or 3 or more people, for example, and maybe they're kids and they're moving around, then yeah, we would want to go with continuous autofocus, and we would want to increase the size of the focusing square and just move it over the subject that we're interested in. And that will lock the eye focus for that subject. Maybe you have a child with their friends. Of course, you want to have your own child in focus, right? So there's different ways to use it. So that's something to keep in mind when you are using these squares. When you have the all area or a big area on, it does better on the continuous focus. Some of these features can be controlled when we come into the menu. Autofocus, manual focus, face and eye detection. We can go face detection on, and we can choose whether we want the left eye priority or the right eye priority. So the idea on this is that if you turn eye detection off, it's going to go into a face detection type of setting. To get that back on, we would come in and we would turn it to auto or left or right, depending on which one we wanted, right? There it is. So another cool feature is a number of camera manufacturers have started building algorithms into the software of their cameras to be able to control what type of subject we're looking at, whether it's an animal, a bird, motorcycle, airplanes, trains, cars. Just depending on what we're shooting, the camera can help us focus, but we're going to set this to off for now. And there's a couple other tools that I want to show in here and make some recommendations. We'll cover most of these settings in the deep menu. If it's a feature, I demonstrate that on the crash course. Pre-AF is something that I recommend leaving turned off. If you turn it on, the camera will start pre-focusing. It'll drain your battery faster. It'll mess you up. I've never found a great way to use it, but there are probably some situations where it could be useful. Autofocus plus manual focus is interesting because it allows us to get a focus, and while holding the shutter button halfway down, then we rotate the focus wheel and we can adjust the focus accordingly. So the idea there is that you get autofocus first, and then you could tweak with your manual focus as long as you're holding that shutter button halfway down. Manual focus assist, there's a couple really nice tools in here, including focus peak highlight. We're going to change this to maybe a red color to make it easy to see. Focus peaking doesn't work with autofocus. We have to go into the manual focusing to see this. Kind of hard to see. I'll zoom in, but you're going to see this red highlight. So zoom out a little bit. There it is. Kind of on the shoulders and around the frame of this guy right here. So I'm pushing the joystick into the camera body to zoom in and get a closer look to this red peaking. So if I change the focusing, it's going to change into red. So the idea of this is the red overlay is appearing on areas of high contrast. It's a great focusing tool if you need it, if you're having a hard time seeing if it's sharp or not. And that is referred to as peaking focus. We can change the color of it if we want. If we want something like yellow, maybe blue, come in here. And now we get this like bluish kind of outline. Another cool focusing tool that we have is the split image. I'm going to leave it on monochrome just to explain this. And the idea is that we get these almost like rows of gray, alternating gray patterns. You'll notice that the box over my face is in black and white. The other setting color would leave that in color. So as I rotate the focus ring, what you'll notice is the blinds in the up and down position, they're not correctly aligned. So as I rotate this, when they all go into line, right about here, oh, maybe it's too far. Right about there, I know this is in focus. This is a manual focusing tool. We also have the digital micro prism, where the idea is that we look in this prism area, kind of like an overlay that helps us see sharp patterns. Let's turn this back to off. So those are some of just the focusing tools that we're seeing for stills. Let's take a look at the focusing modes for video. So if I take this, flip this guy over to video mode, now we're in the video mode. If I push on my joystick, I'm not getting those squares. They're not popping up like they used to, right? So how do we access the modes and how do we change them in video? Coming into the menu again. So coming into the AF mode, which is really the focusing clusters, there's only two of them. There's the multi and the area. So what the multi does, especially when the camera is on autofocus continuous, which it is the camera is going to focus on the nearest subject to it. If I put my hand in front of the camera, you can see it's in focus. I put it down, it refocuses on my picture. Essentially, the camera is doing the heavy lifting. It's just focusing on whatever is closest to the camera. If we do this and we put it into an autofocus single mode, nothing's going to happen until we push the autofocus on button. Any kind of serious focusing, like in Hollywood, they have a person dedicated to adjusting the focus. That's the first AC. So in those situations where you don't want it to change, you're in manual focus. That means the camera's not going to make any of these changes on its own. So the how still all applies. We can engage focusing with a halfway shutter button. Same basic concepts as stills, but we have to tell the camera which of the modes we want: manual, continuous, or single, depending on what we're doing. And we still have these other clusters that we can come in here and we can choose the area. When we switch over to area cluster in video mode, now we have the box that we're used to. We don't have all of the same size control as we did in the stills mode. It's essentially we're saying focus on this box wherever we put it. And if we need a greater area, go to that multi-mode. So you can touch as well on the monitor. So when I have that turned on and I come back into continuous, the camera is going to focus what is ever in that box and only that box, right? So if I move it over here and I put my hand in, the camera is going to ignore that. One question that I'm sure I'll get: what about face and eye detection? Yes, face and eye detection, great. It's coming in the menu. Come back to multi, face and auto detection on, and there it is. If we're in the continuous, that means the camera is going to be updating the focus depending on how close the subject is, and we should be good to go. You can also re-engage it. Tons of different focusing techniques. There's a lot of other information and ways to tweak focusing. It's very deep. We will cover that in the menu system.